Someday Angeline by Sachar, Chapter 16, Crazy Driver. It was a clear, crisp fall morning, splashed in sunshine, and although most of the birds had already headed south for the winter, there were still a few to be seen, chirping above the garbage truck. The fallen leaves cracked under its wheels as it rolled down the road, lined on both sides by trees, red, gold, and brown, and by garbage cans, silver and bright, billowing with garbage. The truck stopped, and both Abel and Gus got out and walked to the nearest garbage. Abel, smiling as he had been all morning, like the cat that ate the canary, breathed in the fresh scent of fallen leaves mixed with old coffee grounds and crusty eggshells. "I met Mr. Bone last night," he said. "And?" questioned Gus. "She's beautiful," said Abel, grinning foolishly. He lifted a metal can and dumped it in the back of the truck. "Light as a feather," he commented. Gus smiled at his partner. "Oh, yeah?" he said. Angelina woke on her sofa bed and instantly sat up as if from a terrible dream. "Why do I have to go back to Miss Hardlick's class at all?" she asked aloud, although she knew her father was already at work. "Why can't I just wait a couple of days until everything is straightened out and then go straight to Mr. Bones' class?" She frowned. "I mean, Mr. Bones' class," she muttered. Last night, her father had told her Mr. Bones' real name. He had come in whistling and humming. The parts he couldn't whistle, she had never seen him so happy. It made her smile and laugh just to look at him. But when he told her Mr. Bones' true name, the smile dropped from her face. "Miss Turbone," Abel had explained. "Oh," said Angeline, "that's too bad." It was like he had told her there was no Santa Claus. She got out of bed and tried to get ready for school as quickly as she could, but it seemed to take her forever. She knew that everyone would look at her funny and stare at her when she returned to class. After all that had happened, she didn't want to call extra attention to herself by walking in late. Yet she couldn't get herself to move quickly. She nearly missed her school bus. When the bus stopped in front of the school, she was the last one to get out of her seat. Very slowly, she walked down the aisle between the rows of seats, and then stepped down the stairs to the parking lot. She put both feet on one step before moving down to the next one. She continued to walk slowly across the parking lot and into the schoolyard. "You better walk faster," she told her feet, "so I'm not late." She walked so slowly she was almost walking backward. On all sides, kids hurried past her to their classrooms until at last she was the only one still outside. Then the bell rang. "See," she said, "now I'm late." She stood outside Miss Hardlick's door. She stood outside Miss Hardlick's door. She stood outside Mrs. Hardlick's door. She opened it. "The capital of—" Miss Hardlick broke off in the middle of her sentence when she saw Angeline. She watched her walk to her seat in the back of the room. Everyone stared at her just as she knew they would. "You're late," said Mrs. Hardlick. She didn't say anything. She saw Christy Mathewson give her a tiny wave that made her feel a little better. "All right," said Mrs. Hardlick. "Let's see if we can get through the rest of the day without your disrupting my class again, shall we?" Mrs. Hardlick looked down at her book. "Where was I? Okay, who can tell me the capital of France?" Nobody raised a hand. Angeline knew the answer, but she didn't dare raise her hand. "Come on, class," urged Mrs. Hardlick. "What's the capital of Paris? What's the capital of France?" "Geez." Still nobody raised a hand. "Geez," thought Angeline. She even told them the answer. Philip finally raised his hand. "Chicago?" he tried. "No, I'm sorry," said Mrs. Hardlick, "but that was a good guess. Chicago was the capital of Illinois." "Springfield was the capital of Illinois." But Angeline knew better than to tell that to Mrs. Hardlick. Judy Martin raised her hand. "Cleveland?" she said. She tried. "Or Massachusetts?" "No, but those were both very excellent choices, Judy," said Mrs. Hardlick. "It shows you're thinking. Cleveland is the capital of Ohio, and Massachusetts is a state. Columbus was the capital of Ohio." Finally, Mrs. Hardlick proudly told the class the capital of France was Paris. "Write that down in your notebook so you don't forget." Angeline realized something she knew all along. Mrs. Hardlick liked it when the class gave wrong answers. Mrs. Hardlick liked to be able to give the right answer herself. What's the capital of England?" asked Mrs. Hardlick. "I don't believe it," thought Angeline. She almost gave it away again. Angeline raised her hand, hoping that Mrs. Hardlick would call on her so she could give a wrong answer, but Philip had his hand raised. "London," he said. That's right, said Mrs. Hardlick, sounding a little disappointed. She should have called on Angeline. Angeline would have said Mexico City. After that, Angeline raised her hand to every question, but Mrs. Hardlick refused to call on her until she had no other choice. Who was the second president of the United States, she asked. Angeline's arm shot up like a rocket. Mrs. Hardlick looked around. There was nobody else to call on. Okay, Angeline, she said dejectedly. Betsy Ross, said Angeline. Mrs. Hardlick smiled. No, I'm sorry, she said, but that was good thinking. That is a correct answer, but to a different question. The second president of the United States was, now write this down in your notebooks, John Quincy Adams. Angeline wrote it down, even though she knew that John Quincy Adams was the sixth president, and that just plain John Adams was the second. But she had to wonder how Mrs. Hardlick could get it wrong when she had the answer right there in front of her. Mrs. Hardlick called on Angeline several more times. What was Mark Twain's real name? Clark Kent. How much is 12 times 12? 12. No, but I can see how you reached that answer, but I'm afraid it is incorrect. It shows you were thinking. Thank you, Mrs. Hardlick, said Angeline. She was glad that she'd be out of this classroom and away from Mrs. Hardlick in a couple of days. Even though she had discovered how to get along, it was beginning to drive her crazy. The birds sang, the leaves cracked, the garbage truck came screeching around a corner, nearly hitting a parked car. Hey, slow down, urged Gus as he held onto the dashboard. Abel turned and looked at him absent-mindedly. Sorry, he said. Will you watch the road? Gus shouted back at him. He buckled his seatbelt. It was something he rarely did, since he had to keep getting in and out of the truck to collect the garbage. Sorry, Abel said. I wasn't paying attention. I was thinking about... Stop! Yelled Gus. Abel slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a sudden halt, causing garbage to fly out over the top of it and onto the street. Gus shook his head and sighed. You just missed that dog, he said. Did you even see it? Sorry, said Abel. I guess I was thinking about Melissa. No kidding, said Gus. He unfastened his seatbelt, and he and Abel got out of the truck to pick up the garbage that had fallen out. Most of it had fallen out of the garbage bags, so they had to pick up each bit of garbage off the street. Abel picked up a milk carton and an empty can of peas. Beautiful day, don't you think, he said. Lovely, murmured Gus as he tried to pick up a broken jar of tomato sauce without cutting himself. Actually, he was glad to see that Abel had a woman on his mind. Did I tell you about Melissa? Abel asked. Gus laughed. You haven't stopped talking about her. Well, I just think she'll make a good teacher for Angeline, that's all. Oh, I see, said Gus. You're just worried about Angeline having a good teacher. That's right, Abel insisted. Why, what else would you think? Gus smirked. Oh, nothing. What? Did you think I was in love with her or something? Why would I think that? Asked Gus. You're only looking for a good teacher for Angeline. That's right, said Abel. One that's beautiful, Gus added. Yes, said Abel. Oh, no. Oh, you don't understand. Gus laughed. They picked up the remainder of the garbage off the street and started to get back into the truck. Other side, said Gus. I'll drive. Gary Boone stared sadly at his shoes. It was recess again, and he had nothing to do. He didn't even like looking at Mr. Bone's fish anymore. They reminded him of Angeline. Everything reminded him of her. He wondered if he'd ever see her again. He hadn't told even one joke all day. Suddenly, two hands covered his eyes. Guess who? Said a familiar voice from behind. He didn't have to guess. He knew who it was. Although he couldn't believe it, he felt so happy he almost burst into tears. He couldn't speak for a moment. Then he said, Gymnasium. Angeline laughed. It was the funniest joke she'd ever heard. Gary turned around in delight. You're back, he declared. So are you, said Angeline. I've always been here, said Gary. You're back to me, said Angeline. Gary was flabbergasted. What? When? He didn't know what to say first. What did Mrs. Hardlick say? Is she being mean to you? I figured it out, said Angeline. All I have to do is answer every question wrong, and everybody likes me. Gee, said Gary. I do that all the time, and nobody likes me. I like you, said Angeline. Gary smiled at her. His eyes were misty. He liked her, too. Do you have any new jokes? She asked him. He cried. That's the end of chapter 16.